I recently picked up a book that it completely caught me off guard.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because it starts with this connection I never in a million years would have made. Picture this. It's the 1970s.
Okay.
And there's a teenager growing up in Enniscorthy, which is this quiet, deeply traditional town in Ireland.
Right.
He's an altar boy. He's completely steeped in the high rituals, the incense, the stained glass of the Catholic Church. But he's also harboring these hidden, unacknowledged desires. He feels incredibly isolated.
A very specific kind of lonely.
Exactly. Then one day he opens a novel and finds his exact incredibly specific internal world just staring right back at him.
Yeah.
That intense mix of religious ecstasy and confusing, almost dangerous sexuality.
But the novel isn't set in Ireland.
No. That's the crazy part. It's set in a 1930s Harlem storefront church.
Yeah.
And the main character is a 14-year-old black boy named John Grimes.
It's an incredible parallel, isn't it? It just goes to show how truly transcendent great literature can be.
It really does. And that realization is exactly what brings us to today's deep dive. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, and I absolutely love devouring Bent's books to find these deeply relatable human stories.
And I'm thrilled to be here with you to help connect the historical dots.
Our mission today is to dive into Colm Tóibín's brilliant, layered book on James Baldwin. We are going to unpack Tóibín's analysis of Baldwin and really try to understand how Baldwin synthesized the deepest pains of race, of sexuality, and of the private human soul into some of the most electric writing of the 20th century.
It is a remarkable journey to trace for anyone listening, whether you've read every single word Baldwin ever wrote or you're just vaguely familiar with his name.
Right.
We are going to connect the dots between Baldwin's deeply interior fiction, his blisteringly urgent political essays, and the broader historical context of a radically changing America. Tóibín brings this unique novelist's eye to our sources, showing us how Baldwin didn't just document history.
He interrogated it.
Exactly. He interrogated the human soul that somehow survives within it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think we have to start with the sheer sound of Baldwin's writing. Honestly, you can't talk about James Baldwin without talking about that prose.
You really can't.
Tóibín makes it clear that Baldwin's style wasn't just decorative, it was his actual method of thinking. But it's a very, very specific style.
It is. The source material spends a good amount of time breaking down Baldwin's unique literary DNA. Baldwin himself once said he aimed for what the novelist Henry James called perception at the pitch of passion.
Which, that sounds beautiful, but what does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it means he created this fascinating hybrid. On one hand, you have the soaring, melancholy blues and jazz rhythms. Think of the pacing of musicians like Miles Davis or Ray Charles.
Okay, yeah.
On the other hand, you have the rhythmic, almost hypnotic repetitions of the King James Bible and the fiery rhetoric of the Harlem storefront church.
Because he grew up in that church.
Exactly. He was a teen preacher himself. But then, and this is the really genius part, he layered all of that with the complex syntax of the English literary heritage. He used these long sentences, lots of pauses, subordinate clauses, careful qualifications.
So instead of just giving you a straightforward, punchy sentence, he writes in a way that forces you to slow down, to realize that the truth is rarely black and white.
Precisely. He was actively writing against the idea of simplicity.
And that complexity is exactly why Baldwin pushed so hard against the grain of what was known at the time as the protest novel. Tóibín points out that Baldwin was actually highly critical of works like Richard Wright's famous novel, Native Son.
Yes.
Which is fascinating because Wright was initially a mentor to Baldwin, wasn't he?
He was. But Baldwin felt that protest novels, even while trying to expose horrible injustices, inadvertently reduced their black protagonists to mere sociology.
Just a product of their environment.
Right. Take Native Son. The main character, Bigger Thomas, is largely depicted as a product of his brutal environment. Baldwin argued that characters shouldn't be defined solely by their hatred, their fear, or the brutal societal conditions bequeathed to them at birth.
Because doing that robs them of their humanity.
Exactly. It robs them of their agency.
Which brings us directly to Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Here we see his own philosophy actually put into practice. Before reading Tóibín's analysis, I just assumed Baldwin's early work was heavily focused on external battles against white oppression.
That's a common assumption.
But that's not the focus here at all.
Not at all. Baldwin turns the lens entirely inward. For those listening who haven't read it, the novel takes place over a single day and night in a Harlem church. And the true battleground is the inner life of this 14-year-old boy, John Grimes.
Right.
Baldwin elevates this internal struggle. John is wrestling with his domineering, hypocritical father, his burgeoning sexuality, and the terrifying prospect of his soul's salvation. He elevates all of that to epic, almost biblical proportions.
And this is where Tóibín's personal connection, the one I mentioned at the start, becomes so incredibly poignant. Tóibín writes about reading this novel as an 18-year-old in Ireland. And at the time, he had almost joined a seminary himself.
Yes.
He recognized the overwhelming, almost dangerous power of church ritual that John Grimes experiences.
The scene with Elisha is the perfect example of that.
Yes. There's this incredibly charged scene where John watches an older boy, Elisha, dancing in the spirit during a church service. The imagery Baldwin uses completely blurs the line between religious fervor and intense physical desire. It's confusing, it's intoxicating.
It is.
And Tóibín relates this directly to his own youth as an altar boy in Augustus Pugin's neo-Gothic cathedral in Enniscorthy. He describes swinging the thurible of incense, surrounded by the intense atmosphere of the Catholic Mass, all while dealing with his own hidden homosexuality. Baldwin managed to capture an unfathomable panic and desire that completely bypassed geography. It spoke directly to an Irish kid decades later.
It is a stunning connection. But at the same time, our sources remind us that we have to acknowledge that geography and history do haunt Baldwin's novel, just in a different way.
How so?
The characters in Harlem are carrying a massive silent weight, the Great Migration.
Right. This is the movement of roughly 6 million Black Southerners leaving their ancestral homes for the North to escape Jim Crow laws and racial violence.
Exactly. They moved north for survival and opportunity, but they brought their trauma with them. In the novel, the American South functions as this terrifying lost place of memory. It's a shadow world where brutal things happened, things that animate the fears of the parents in the church and silently seep into the children.
Wow.
The characters are physically in New York, but psychologically they are wrestling with the ghosts of the South.
And Tóibín brilliantly connects that haunting to his own hometown, too. Even though Enniscorthy seemed like a quiet, sleepy town in the 1970s, it was haunted by the 1798 rebellion. Tóibín mentions looking out at Vinegar Hill, where a doomed, bloody battle left the town in flames almost 2 centuries prior. It just shows how the past is never really past.
No, it isn't.
It lives in the air a community breathes, shaping how people view themselves and their safety.
It dictates the boundaries of what a community feels is possible.
It really does. It dictates how we navigate the world and the identities we project just to survive. But speaking of how we navigate those identities, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sources take a fascinating detour into the concept of passing.
Yes, this is a very revealing part of Tóibín's analysis.
It blew my mind. Tóibín brings up Richard Wright's radio play Man of All Work. In this play, a Black man literally dresses up as a Black woman just to get a domestic job with a white family. And once he's in the house, he becomes the target of their bizarre, racist, sexual projections. It's about the masks people are forced to wear. But then, Tóibín pairs this with a real-life, historical event. John Howard Griffin's massively famous 1961 book, Black Like Me.
For listeners who might not know, Griffin was a white journalist who underwent medical treatments to darken his skin so he could travel through the segregated South and experience it as a Black man.
Which, looking back today, sounds completely absurd. A white guy puts on a disguise to go find out if racism is real.
It is a striking juxtaposition, and if we synthesize why Tóibín includes this in his analysis of Baldwin, it highlights a deeply flawed, almost tragic assumption of that era. There was a prevailing belief in mainstream white America that a white man in disguise might somehow be the most objective or credible witness to Black suffering.
That is wild.
Because Griffin was fundamentally white, his audience trusted his report.
And his book was a massive bestseller. He was doing earnest, heavily moral interviews on shows like Mike Wallace, explaining the pain of racism to white audiences as if he had discovered a new continent.
Right. Griffin's earnest, almost clinical tone contrasts so sharply with Baldwin's own essays from the exact same era. Works like the fire next time.
Yeah.
Baldwin didn't need a medical disguise or a gimmick to report on the human condition. He used his own lived experience, rendered in this diamond-hard, electrifying prose, to expose not just the physical brutality of racism, but the intricate, devastating psychological damage it inflicted on everyone involved.
It really highlights the tension between the public personas we accept and the private truths we ignore. And that tension actually leads to a really striking comparison Tóibín makes in the book, a comparison between James Baldwin and Barack Obama.
This is perhaps one of the most compelling insights in the source material.
I thought so too. At first glance, you think, okay, 2 very famous Black American men. But Tóibín points out they both had these intense connections to the Black church in their youth. And strangely enough, they both had to leave the United States to fully understand their own Americanness.
Yes.
Baldwin found his perspective by moving to France, and Obama found his while visiting Kenya.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources reveal a profound divergence in how these two men ultimately use their voices and their mastery of language. Obama, operating in the political sphere, ultimately used language to console, to build bridges, and to close the circle of the American narrative.
Right.
Think of his famous speeches. They are almost always driving toward a message of unity, an idea that despite our painful history, we are fundamentally one people moving toward a more perfect union.
He used language to heal the wound, or at least bandage it.
It's exactly. Baldwin, on the other hand, operating strictly as an artist and a truth teller, adamantly refused those easy consolations. He used language to interrogate, to rip the bandage off, to expose untidy and deeply uncomfortable truth that politicians usually try to smooth over.
Yeah, Baldwin wasn't trying to make anyone comfortable.
Not at all. He recognized the systemic rot-level failures of the state. He even eerily predicted the devastating rise of the modern prison industrial complex long before it became a mainstream talking point. Our sources highlight how he warned that a society that fails to deal with the reality of its own pain and ambiguity becomes, in his exact words, monstrous.
That word gives me chills. Monstrous.
Not just you.
And to avoid that monstrousness, to avoid being consumed by a society that demands you fit into a neat little box, Baldwin believed you had to relentlessly guard the private soul, which takes us to his own exile. Baldwin moved to Paris in 1948, and get this, he left with just $40 in his pocket.
Wait, $40?
$40. Can you imagine the bravery or maybe the desperation it takes to cross the Atlantic with basically nothing?
That is astounding.
But Paris offered this illusion of freedom from the suffocating, rigid racial categories of America. He could just be a writer. But Paris is also where he wrote his highly controversial second novel, Giovanni's Room.
Controversial is an understatement for the 1950s.
Truly. When he submitted the manuscript, his American publisher outright told him to burn it. They said it would ruin his career.
And why was that?
Because for a Black author who had just gained acclaim for a novel about Black life in Harlem, this new book featured entirely white characters, and the plot focused exclusively on a tragic homosexual love affair between an American named David and an Italian bartender named Giovanni.
It defied every expectation the literary establishment had for him.
It did. And Baldwin's response to the pushback was incredibly telling. He said he simply didn't have the space in one book to handle both the Negro problem and the sexual moral light. He felt that if he tried to tackle systemic racism and the deep internal complexities of homosexual love simultaneously, the book would collapse under its own weight.
He needed to isolate the private soul to examine it properly.
Exactly.
And when we break down the core tragedy of Giovanni's Room, we see exactly what he meant. This is not a political book demanding social rights or changes in legislation. As Tóibín notes, it is a cry from the depths. It is about a man, David, who is so paralyzed by fear, so constrained by the internalized shame of what society says a man should be, that he simply cannot allow himself to love.
Right.
He rejects Giovanni's genuine affection, and that betrayal sets off a tragic chain of events, culminating in Giovanni's execution by guillotine. Baldwin strips away the macro politics of the era to show how we are often our own most brutal jailers.
To really drive that point home, Tóibín contrasts Giovanni's Room with a novel by another Black American exile living in Paris at the time, William Gardner Smith. Smith wrote a book called The Stone Face, which directly depicted the real-world 1961 police massacre of Algerians in Paris. This was a horrific event where French police attacked demonstrators and bodies were literally tossed into the River Seine.
It was a massive, highly visible political atrocity.
Right. And Baldwin was fully aware of this violence. He lived there, he spoke about it in interviews, but he deliberately excluded that kind of sweeping macro-political panorama from Giovanni's Room. He kept the focus entirely claustrophobic, entirely inside the minds and bedrooms of his characters.
He did. And Tóibín makes a brilliant comparison here. He compares Baldwin's claustrophobic focus on the internal world to Oscar Wilde's De Profundis. That is the searing, beautiful confession Wilde wrote while he was imprisoned for his own homosexuality.
Wow, yeah.
Both works are intense, self-lacerating examinations of guilt, of passion, and the tragic consequences of emotional cowardice. Baldwin understood that, yes, systemic oppression is horrifying, but the ways in which we repress our true selves and how we destroy the people who dare to love us because we are afraid can be equally fatal to the human spirit.
That is such a profound way to look at it. But of course, Baldwin couldn't stay isolated in a Parisian room forever. As the 1960s exploded, so did his public profile. He was called back to America by the sheer urgency of the civil rights movement. By 1963, Baldwin was everywhere.
The pace of his life then was incredible.
He was meeting with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, a meeting that, by the way, went so poorly and got so heated that the playwright Lorraine Hansberry literally walked out in disgust.
He was entirely uncompromising.
He was touring the Deep South with Medgar Evers, putting his life on the line. He was leading protests in Paris in solidarity with the March on Washington. And inevitably, he was attracting massive surveillance from the FBI. They were keeping tabs on everything he did.
They absolutely were.
There's even a note from an FBI agent who flagged Baldwin's third novel, Another Country, specifically noting it was dangerous because it featured a black man making love to a white female.
It is exhausting just to hear that itinerary. And this frantic, highly visible pace brings up a crucial critique from literary figures of the time, specifically the critic Lionel Trilling. Trilling essentially asked a question that plagues a lot of artists. How could a writer like Baldwin maintain the delicate, quiet inwardness required to write great fiction while living with such extravagant publicness? How do you protect the artist's sensitive soul when the activist is constantly shouting on television or standing on the front lines?
It's a great question, and I love how Tóibín addresses it in the book. He offers this incredible, quiet anecdote to show how Baldwin maintained his soul and his unique perspective amidst all the noise. Baldwin was commissioned by a magazine to cover the heavyweight boxing match between Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston.
Okay.
Now, sitting right next to him at ringside was the famous writer Norman Mailer.
Two very different men.
Completely different. Mailer is sweating and writing all this macho, puffed-up prose about high destiny guts and comparing the fighters to pumas and tigers.
Huh.
He's entirely bought into the spectacle of violence.
Right.
But Baldwin has zero interest in the violence or the bravado. He looks at these two massive, fearsome men and focuses entirely on their vulnerability, their privacy, and their underlying softness. He actually visits Liston in his training camp before the fight, realizes the man is using his terrifying toughness as a shield against a world that hates him, and Baldwin simply tells him, "I wish you well."
That moment is the absolute essence of James Baldwin. He refused the expected narrative. While everyone else saw gladiators, he saw frightened human beings. And the synthesis of the public and the private, the Harlem of his youth and the bohemian world of Greenwich Village, finally comes together in that third novel the FBI was so worried about, Another Country.
That book is a masterpiece, but it's a tough read. For those that haven't read it, the tragic hero of the book's opening is a man named Rufus. Rufus is a brilliant but deeply damaged black musician who ultimately jumps to his death from the George Washington Bridge.
Rufus represents the terrifying reality of what Baldwin feared he himself might have become if he hadn't managed to escape to Paris with those $40.
Exactly. Rufus is caught in the crushing gears of American society. He is loved by white friends in Greenwich Village, but he's deeply suspicious of their motives. He is so poisoned by the history of race in America that he can't accept their love, and he ends up destroying the white woman who loves him and then destroying himself.
This raises an important question. What exactly was the poison Baldwin was diagnosing through characters like Rufus or David in Giovanni's room? According to Tóibín's analysis of the text, Baldwin's ultimate thesis was that the core deformation of America lies in its obsession with an infantile, childish ideal of masculinity.
Like the John Wayne cowboy myth.
Exactly. The insistence on cowboys and tough guys, the belief that strength means never showing weakness. This manifests in these rigid, unyielding categories we force people into. Black or white, straight or gay, tough or weak. Baldwin saw this obsession with categorization as a paralytic nightmare. It keeps us from actually knowing each other. The true struggle for his characters, and by extension for America itself, is the terrifying necessity of surrendering to the undefined space of genuine love and complex, messy human reality. Love, for Baldwin, wasn't a romance novel. It was a terrifying shedding of armor.
So what does this all mean? If we look back at the journey Colm Tóibín has taken us on today, we see James Baldwin as far more than just a famous civil rights icon or a face on a vintage magazine cover. Through his rhythmic, jazz-infused prose and his fearless self-examination, he was truly an architect of the human soul. He showed us that the deepest, most explosive political crises often stem from a fundamental failure to face our own private, terrifying vulnerabilities.
Indeed. Baldwin taught us that you cannot fix the world if you are constantly hiding from yourself. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that builds on Baldwin's legacy, but challenges us in our current moment.
Please do.
Baldwin famously wrote that we are responsible to unborn generations because, as he put it, we are the only witnesses they have. We live in an era right now where our lives are relentlessly public. We are curated, filtered, and broadcast constantly on social media. Yet our deepest, most vulnerable private lives, that messy inwardness Baldwin fought so fiercely to protect, are often hidden behind those very avatars. We project toughness or perfection, just like the characters Baldwin critiqued.
Yeah, that is so true.
How then are we truly witnessing for the next generation? Are we actively cultivating the complex inwardness and genuine love that Baldwin championed? Or are we simply adding to the noise of the extravagant publicness he warned us about?